Hello, I'm Mary Jo, and I'm going to be talking about my perception and understanding of God. Now, for many years, I had a real problem with the word God. It just wasn't a word I used, and certainly not out loud. And I think this is because of childhood associations with it, and also because of other people's perception of what God means to people who talk about belief in God. So I'm going to begin with what God is not for me. And at the most basic level, it's not the little old man sitting up on a cloud who is judgmental and who watches your every word and move, which is the childhood perception. But I'd like to go on. It's also, for me, not the creator of the universe. I don't know what created the universe. And as a Quaker, I can only speak from my own experience, what I've either experienced myself or what I believe really is true, makes sense to me. And when I think of the vastness of the universe and our lack of understanding really where it even ends or where it could possibly have come from, how can I possibly talk about God as a creator in this? I don't believe in a God who is interventionist in either the physical world or the affairs of man. Do you remember when there was a tsunami some years ago and headlines in the newspaper said, "How could God do this to innocent people?" Well, God does not, for me, knock tectonic plates together, nor does he inspire people with the sort of evil that leads to wars and mayhem and massacres. My God does not intervene in the world in that way. Nor is it for me manifest in a human being, a single human being. In other words, I don't believe that Jesus is God or that there is any human being that has been God. And in the same way, it's not a chatty sort of person to whom I can say, "Oh, I'm in trouble today, God, can you help me out?" My God doesn't help me in that way. What it is a very strong force, a very strong force for good and of love within me, which I think has always been there, but it does need for me to be aware of it and to acknowledge it, which I haven't always done, and even now, although I try to, I don't always acknowledge that. Quakers talk about the promptings of love and truth in heart. This little book, Advices and Queries, is the first chapter of this book, a compendium of Quaker faith and belief, which we rewrite every generation, actually. But it's the first chapter of this. And of the Advices and Queries, the first of these is, "Take heed, dear friends, to the promptings of love and truth in your hearts. Trust them as the leadings of God." And for me, that's a good definition of God. I also like the words of the poet Charles Causley, who says, "God who does not dwell on high in the wide, unwinking sky, but whose gentle counsels start simply in the human heart." This, to me, is a very, very meaningful approach to God. So how do I encounter this? Basically, there are several ways. One is the unbidden religious moment. I've had one peak experience of God in my life. I have a feeling that's probably my lot. I think probably you don't get more than one of those in a lifetime, but it was enough to radically change me and to alter my perception of myself, the world, of others, and everything. I get, in addition to the peak experiences, what I call rolling hills experiences, sort of semi there, and those can come on at any time. I remember it happened a few times when I walked down a certain sidewalk on my way to work, and I used to keep going down that sidewalk just hoping, that perhaps that would happen again. But it doesn't happen that way. It does come unbidden. And there are other times just being aware of nature, the universe, and people around me. I don't believe I have any opinions about the creation of the universe, but I certainly can feel manifest of the otherness of the mystical nature by looking at the skies, looking at a grain of sand, looking at a flower, looking at somebody who smiles in a crowd. And that, I think, is an experience of God. And there's something to be said, too, about the discipline of making time for an awareness of God in your life. And I realize this more and more as time goes on. It's important to take time, perhaps before a meal, just to pause and be still and realize the presence of God. It's good in the day to have a definite time that you do this, which just gives up space, it gives room for this awareness to be. And it's also, for me, important to go to meeting for worship. The advices say to go when you're not feeling particularly warm or full of religion, but to go and to be there. And that discipline, too, does give me space in which I can encounter God and in which I can listen more closely to those promptings of love and truth in my heart.
My name is Imran, and I was actually born into a Muslim family. We'd come to England when I was 6, but I wasn't really brought up a Muslim. I know very little about it, and I suppose I was just a standard English agnostic through my teens and 20s. But it was in the middle of my life, I think I just turned 40, when I felt really unhappy. There was a real desperation in me. You know, the other things in my life were going fine. I had a family, I had a career, that was all just great. But there was still something deeply wrong. I didn't have the words even to express to my wife what there was wrong. I couldn't understand it at all. You know how these feelings later are actually quite hard to pin down. They just disappear. But things happen and you remember that. And this wasn't my imagination, because I remember the occasion when I was on a number 43 bus going down Holloway Road. I was wearing a pinstripe suit, I was carrying my briefcase, I was on my way to a meeting on the 12th floor of the Stock Exchange Tower, but I found myself weeping. There were tears streaming down my face. So, you know, there was something deeply wrong. You know, I have done this session once before, and I told this story. And a young man came up to me afterwards and said, "I know exactly what you mean. I've been on the number 43 bus." But no, there was something. It wasn't the bus. There was something deeply wrong. And now, of course, I have the words. It was a spiritual lack. I was needing some access to God. And I didn't know what to do about it. So I used what I'd been reading in my teens, which is about stilling yourself. You know, that way where you say, you know, clarify yourself, sit and meditate. And I was sitting just by myself. I was not looking outwards to God in any way. But what happened was that I was really deeply yearning. I needed something very, very much. I had no idea what. And to my astonishment, I was answered. There was something that responded. And it was a very tiny kind of feeling. But what came with it was love, a deep sense of love. It was astonishing. And that really heartened me, and I kept going. I found out about the existence of Quakers, and I decided I'd go to a Quaker meeting where I was, and I'd found out the address. But before I could go, I had to go on a business trip. I went to the States, and that first night, I was lying insomniac, very jet-lagged, really aching everywhere, and deeply unhappy again. And really, really, really deeply unhappy, and yearning again. And this time, I was responded to. I was visited. I was held. It was an incredibly powerful experience that time. And I think the effects lasted for days. I just felt smoothed out. And then I went to my first Quaker meeting, and it was like coming home. It was just what I needed for taking on this journey. Now, you know, I didn't understand quite what it was, but it was something I could do. It was a way, it was the silence, the stillness was the place where I could take it on. Now, how wonderful it would be if I could say I every Sunday I come to Quaker meeting and I sit and I'm swept away by God. And really it's not like that. Life is not nearly as wonderful as that. But there was another occasion. This time I was not desperate. In fact, I was incredibly happy. We'd gone as a family on holiday. We were in the Pyrenees and we'd walked up. And my wife stopped with our little children and I said I would go on to the snow line. And I got up to the snow line, was sitting on some rocks, and everything was so wonderful. And that stillness developed into me and I was just again held. So maybe it's not to do with unhappiness or happiness. I don't know what it's to do with, to tell you the truth. So I can only tell it the way it is. And as you can see, I haven't described notions of God or what God might be. I think I've only just described what has happened to me.
So how does my understanding of God and my Quaker faith play itself out in my life? How does it actually affect me in a practical way? Well, on a very practical level, it means that quite a bit of my time is taken up with it. I go to meeting on Sunday, I go to meetings midweek, and I do a certain amount of work just keeping the structure of our Quaker meetings going. We Quakers don't have a paid clergy, and therefore we do a lot of those tasks which are associated with paid clergy in other churches. And this I enjoy doing and I do gladly, but it is a way in which my faith is played out in my life. On a deeper level, it's difficult to divide what is faith and what is action and how they interact. It's much of a wholeness. We believe as Quakers that all life is sacramental, and that means that we should always be in a position where we are at least trying to be aware of God and thinking how we should behave in the world in accordance with what we think we are called to do, by God, by the divine, if you will. And this brings about a certain wholeness and health. And I find if I act according to this, it makes me feel very whole and healthy. If I don't, if I try to stray away from this, I can really feel quite disturbed by it. So that is a guide to the way I live my life. The faith that I've spoken about is based on a God of love. And I often think of the phrase faith, hope, and love, and the greatest of these is love. But there is also faith. There is that being aware, and I do try to find time deliberately to be aware of the presence of God in my life, as well as try to be open to it whenever it should just come to me. Hope. Hope is a difficult one. Hope is really optimism in action. And some people are naturally optimistic and others not so. I tend to be on the pessimistic side. So for me, it is a labor to be optimistic. But that means, the hope means the belief, really, the trust that even very small actions can be meaningful. Even little things that you do in your daily life can build up and have some meaning. They can snowball. They can become something big. Perhaps you will smile at someone and that person will perhaps then think to smile at the next person. It can be that small. And I think it's the same with evil. A small evil or malicious deed can bring about another one, and that too can snowball and become something big. So carry on in hope and in faith, and then in love. If it is of love, it is right, and if it isn't, it isn't. For me, it is really that simple. As Quakers, we do believe that we are all equal in the eyes of God. That means each of us can have some knowledge of the divine. Each of us has the seed of God within us. Each of us is a unique and precious person, a child of God. Now, if you believe that, if that is the basis of your faith, then the way you deal with other people is very much affected by that. And not only on a small daily basis, but the movements that you become involved in, the campaigns, if you will be affected by that. I'm always amazed when people say that religion and politics should be kept separate. That is such a nonsense to me, because politics is the way we behave in the world, and religion tells us how to behave in the world. And so these two are absolutely inseparable. And Quakers have traditionally been very much involved in all sorts of aspects of social justice, of prison reform, of educational reform, of mental health reform, and so forth, as well as the peace movement. And I haven't done dramatic things here. I don't engage in international conciliation work, and I don't go into prisons and deal with violence issues and so forth. But what I do is support those who do. I support them in every way I can, materially if possible. I support them in prayer, if you will, what we Quakers call holding people in the light and holding movements in the light. And I will also support them with my presence when it's needed. And so for me, this is just enormously important. The peace issue is especially grave, and it seems to me we need to continually take action as a measure of faith against the armaments build-up, against the whole military aspect of our society, which does seem so deeply ingrained. So, my faith brings me to a commitment in doing these things, in acting in love and faith and hope, and doing it on a daily and small basis, hoping that it will grow in size, and not feeling guilty. I do feel so strongly about this. None of us should feel guilty about what we can't do, but should do what we can do. And I'd like to finish, curiously, with some quotation from the Buddha, not from Quaker Faith and Practice or a Quaker. Buddha says his disciples are happy because they do not repent the past, nor do they brood over the future. They live in the presence. So live with integrity and love in the present. I think more than that, none of us can do.
I had lunch with a friend, an old friend, one who can do something like this. He started the conversation by saying, "What do you believe?" And I found myself answering, I really hadn't thought this through, I found myself answering, "I believe in uncertainty." Because if people say, "What is God?" I really can't answer that. I remember an occasion when we were a bunch of friends, I think it was our book group, and somebody asked the question, "Do you believe in God?" And I put up my, would everyone who believes in God put up their hand? And I put up my hand. And my good friend sitting next to me said, "But you don't believe in God, do you, Imran?" And I said, "Oh, sorry, I don't. No, I don't believe in God." Now, how can this be that I can both say, yes, I do, and yes, I don't? And I think it's because I don't really understand it. You know, I don't understand what the question means. So what can I say? In a fine old Quaker phrase, what canst thou say? And I think the one thing that I know is the reality of that yearning. Because I know that's my need. And I also know the reality of that experience I've had, which isn't with me always, but I suppose the faith comes, and faith is another word that I've had a great deal of trouble understanding, but I suppose now I've come to understand it as that, as remembering that because the experience isn't there, but you do try and remember that you had that experience, that there is something there to work towards. And of course, that's held within the practice of the use of silence and our meeting for worship, the corporate use of silence. So that's really useful. In my reading, it's been really helpful to find out that what I've experienced does match, of course in a very minor way, we're down in the foothills of the mountains here, what the mystics have written about. The mystics of all disciplines, Christian mystics, Eastern mystics, Buddhists, Hindus, or from my own heritage, Islam, the Sufis, which is a sort of mystical side of Islam. And it does all match. So what's happening to me has been found by many others through the centuries. But it's not just a personal experience. I think what is more important, or where God is more importantly, is in the relationship. And actually a friend of mine helped me to see this very well recently, because there's a very much loved phrase from Advices and Queries near the end, but from George Fox, where he talks about to walk cheerfully over the world, answering that of God in everyone. And the phrase, that of God in everyone, is such an important phrase to Quakers, and it helps to understand about God. But my friend pointed out that he actually said, answering that of God in everyone. This is not a static fact, it's actually a dynamic. It's to do with relationship, that I, that of God in me, answers that of God in you.